Hello, this video is for anyone studying Mametz Wood by Owen Sheers. I have a copy of the poem in front of me while I speak, and it's probably a good idea if you have a copy of the poem in front of you while you listen. Mametz Wood is the first poem in Shears's collection, Skirrid Hill. If you're studying the collection as a whole, you probably want to think about why he chose to put it first. Perhaps Mametz Wood is first in the collection because Owen Shears' visit to Mametz Wood in France was such an important turning point in his life. Maybe he just wished to signal the intentions and themes of the rest of the collection through this poem. He's written elsewhere that he had a strong desire to give a voice to the skeletons of the soldiers in this poem. Maybe you can find examples in other poems in the collection of a desire to give a voice to skeletons of the past. I'm sure you've got your own interpretations of why this poem is first in the collection, and feel free to share them in the comments box below. In terms of form, there are 7 stanzas with 3 lines each. However, the lines vary in length and their use of punctuation and capital letters. So the poem on the page doesn't look uniform and standard and neat. This might be because of the subject matter. The poet is talking about dead bodies being ploughed up in a field in France. So you wouldn't want the poem to look neat and tidy on the page. You would want to make it look uneven and bumpy. In terms of structure, it's important to look at the subject matter that's dealt with in each stanza and the way that the poet has chosen to deal with the subject matter as it moves through the poem. So, for example, you might notice that stanza 1 and stanza 4 are all about the land and about the way that the bodies are being found within the land, whereas the other stanzas are more about the people. And then the final stanza brings them both together, where the people are finally unearthed and freed from the land and their voices are able to be heard. Or you might want to focus on which stanzas are the most graphic in terms of their description of the remains. So you might focus on the 2nd and the 5th stanzas in terms of the description of the remains, with the rest of the stanzas being about the people and the soldiers. It's up to you how you interpret structure, but it is important if you're writing an exam answer or an essay to mention the structure of the poem and examine where the poet has chosen to talk about certain things in the poem. In terms of language, there's an awful lot you can say, and I don't think you can ever be exhaustive in your analysis of this poem. However, I'll touch on a few things that have stood out to me. In terms of the rhyme scheme of the poem, which is a feature of both form and language, you can see quite quickly that there are hardly any words at the end of lines that rhyme. Except, of course, in the 3rd stanza, we have run and guns. Of course, the instinct when you're faced with a gun is to run, but these soldiers have been ordered to walk. Perhaps Shears is trying to emphasise these 2 words by putting them at the end of the line and having them rhyme, in order to emphasise the horror of the story that he's telling. However, we also have in the final stanza the words sung and tongues. Why has the poet chosen to have these rhyming words in the final stanza to emphasise them? He's talking about people's voices finally being heard. And of course, these skeletons don't have tongues anymore, and their song has been unsung for 100 years. Perhaps the poet is trying to end on a optimistic, positive note, that these soldiers are finally getting recognition and finally coming out of the anonymity that the ground has put them in. It's up to you to interpret that yourself, but it is important to think about rhyme scheme, even when it is a rare example of rhyme. Owen Shears uses a lot of metaphors in this poem, and you can find them yourself and have your own interpretations of them, but here are a couple that I've noticed. For example, Shears uses metaphors to contrast beauty with the horror of the scene that he's describing. For example, in the 2nd stanza, he mentions the china plate of a shoulder blade. China is usually quite beautiful. It's man-made to be as beautiful and as delicate as possible. And it's interesting that Shears has used this metaphor to describe a bone sticking out of the ground. Another place that he uses a metaphor to contrast beauty with horror is in the 5th stanza, when he describes the broken mosaic of bone. So instead of seeing a field full of skeletons and a mass grave, he describes a man-made object of beauty. Perhaps this is a comment on war and the man-made nature of war and how it ruins human bodies. Sheers also uses metaphors to juxtapose war and nature and to emphasise just how unnatural war is and how unnatural the deaths of these young men were 100 years ago. For example, in the second stanza, he describes a skull as a broken bird's egg. It's up to you what this imagery means to you, but for me it's a little bit ironic because a bird's egg is supposed to give life. It's a vessel for a new baby bird, and it's a powerful image to describe a skull coming out of the ground as looking like a bird's egg. In the next stanza, the third stanza as well, he describes the machine guns as nesting in the woods. A nest is supposed to be a home for a bird, and these machine guns are hiding in the woods and nesting there like birds in order to kill the men that are walking towards the woods, and I find that a powerful image as well. Sheers also uses a simile to describe the horror of this scene and the horror of war in general. In the fourth stanza, he describes the bodies coming to the surface of this field like a wound working a foreign body to the surface of the skin. So he personifies the world as this a human body that's trying to get rid of a foreign object. And he describes the field that these skeletons are coming out of as a wound. So in this sense, he's trying to convey that war has injured the earth. This is a very common piece of imagery that poets use when they're describing war, that war injures the earth and that wounds are caused and that the earth is scarred by war. Despite the fact that the poem opens in the past tense, the rest of it feels very much in the present tense. The poet repeats the word now throughout the poem. I think he wants the reader to feel very present in this scene that he's describing. I think he wants to emphasise that the effects of war are still ongoing. This war, the First World War, and every other war. As he says in the fourth stanza, the earth stands sentinel. The earth is still grieving, the earth is still affected by war. And I think that's why he's chosen very much a present tense. The perspective that the poet has chosen for this poem is the third person, although it's based somewhat on his first-hand experiences in that he visited this field when the bodies were being discovered. He's chosen the third person, which is quite interesting, and the obvious reasons for this are that he wanted to remain detached and impersonal. Perhaps he wanted to emphasise the impersonal, anonymous nature of these soldiers' deaths. They're still not getting a named burial, even after 100 years, and even when their bodies have been discovered. Of course, all of this is down to your own interpretation, and I'd love to hear your own interpretations below. I'd love to hear that you disagree with me and that you have things to add or things to change. Please feel free to comment. I'm also going to put in the comments box below an account from Owen Sheers as to why he wrote this poem, and I think it's interesting to read if you're interested in this poem. Thanks for watching. Bye bye.